In this continuing part of the lecture on the nervous system, we're going to be talking about the structure of the brain. This is such an amazing organ that controls all the functions that are happening in our body, some consciously, some subconsciously, and so we're going to look at the different parts of the brain and their functions. First of all, let's talk a little bit about how the brain develops. So, at about the 4th week of development, embryonic development, a neural tube starts to develop into the brain, and then eventually that's going to enlarge as growth continues, and that's going to become both the brain and the spinal cord. And within the neural tube you end up with these chambers called ventricles, and these ventricles are important because they're filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and this fluid is found all around the brain, and it's flowing around the brain, and we'll talk about it more when we talk about the protection of the brain, but it plays an important role. The brain weighs about 3 pounds, and if you take your 2 fists and put them together, that's about the size of your brain. And it doesn't look very impressive. You'll get to work on a brain dissection, I believe, in this class. Trying to remember off the top of my head if we have the brain dissection, but I do believe we have brain dissection. So you'll get to see a brain. Doesn't necessarily look very amazing, but again, it is what functions controls all the functions in our body. When you're looking at the brain, there's some parts of the brain that I want to point out. First of all, there's something called the gyri, or singular is gyrus, and that is shown here in the blue. And these are the upraised, kind of heel-looking parts of the brain. So when you look at the brain, you see all this folding. The upraised parts are the gyri, and then the sulci are these grooves within the brain. And again, the singular is sulcus, plural is sulci. So you have these sulci, these little grooves, and then every so often you have a fissure, which is a very deep sulcus. And the fissures divide the brain into different parts. And so as you're identifying different places in the brain, you use the fissures and also the gyri to tell where that location is in relation to the rest of the brain. The main part of the brain, or the largest part of the brain, is called the cerebrum. And it has two halves. It has a left and a right side, and this is the majority of the brain is found in the cerebrum. You can also see here the cerebrum is named, so that the cerebrum is broken up into different parts, and it's named for the skull bones that are found above that. So we have this blue area here, which is the temporal area, named for the temporal bone. We have our occipital lobe. We have our frontal lobe here, and then we have our parietal lobe. And those are the main bones that are found in the skull as well. Down below here you can see the cerebellum, and then also the pons, and the medulla oblongata, which then becomes the spinal cord, and you can see where it's coming out here. So we have the cerebrum here, and then underneath we have the midbrain, which mostly is covered, and you can just see part of it coming out here in the bottom as it's leaving the brain. If we take that cerebrum and we make a nice frontal slice, we can see the areas of the brain. And in the brain we have gray matter, and we also have white matter. And this relates to the nerve fibers that we were talking about before. So the outer part here is also called the cerebral cortex, and this is the gray matter. This is where the cell bodies are found within the brain. And then the white matter is on the inside, and those are the myelinated axons. So it looks white because of the myelination. So we have the gray matter on the out, the white matter on the inside, and then we also have what are called basal nuclei. And basal nuclei are little areas of gray matter within the white matter, and you can see if you point it out here. And we also have the ventricles, So here's pointing to the third ventricle and what's called the lateral ventricle, which breaks into two, and that's where we're going to have our first and second ventricle, our third ventricle, and then we'll have the fourth ventricle that we'll look at. You can't see it in this picture, we'll see it a little bit later. We have the thalamus, which is not part of the cerebrum. That is going to be part of the brainstem that we're going to talk about in a minute, as well as the pons and the medulla oblongata. Something to point out about the brain at this point. Notice these lines here. These are fibers. These are the neurons coming back into the brain. And notice how they go to clear up to the gray matter. So as we look at the brain, we're going to look at the gray matter. This is where all the different parts of the functioning parts of the brain are. Although there are these basal nuclei found deeper inside the brain. But notice that the right side of the brain is going to control the left side of the body. The left side is going to control the right side because these fibers cross as they leave the brain. Here's a sagittal cut showing the cerebrum again. And here we have the frontal lobe. And here you can see the ventricles again. So here's the third ventricle, hypothalamus. Here we have the pituitary gland coming off of the hypothalamus, which is located by the thalamus, underneath the thalamus. Some other things to point out here. Now here's our fourth ventricle. And notice how the ventricles are all connected. So you have our fourth ventricle coming up to connect with our third ventricle, which is going to connect with the first and second ventricle. This area here we call the midbrain. It's up underneath the cerebrum. And then we have the brainstem coming down beneath that. I also want to point out the corpus callosum. And let me go back to this slide in order to do that as well. The corpus callosum is the area that connects I guess it divides, it's division between the right and left side, but it is the connection between the right and left side of the brain. So there's fibers going across the corpus callosum to different parts of the brain. There's some important parts of the cerebrum that have some major functions, and I want to point these out now. We have what's called the primary somatic sensory area. So remember, somatic is dealing with the body, and so we have the somatic sensory area. This is where all the sensory information from all around the body is coming in. This is located in the parietal lobe. And then we have the primary motor area. And this is a part that's going to send out impulses that control all the skeletal muscles, and this is found in the frontal lobe. And I'll show you here in a second, they're actually right next to each other. Then we have something called the Broca's area. And this is an interesting area found in the brain that is involved in speech. And if you have damage to the Broca's area, you're not going to be able to speak. You'll still be able to think, you'll be able to know what you want to say, but you're not going to be able to formulate that into words. And so someone that has damage to the Broca's area, you can figure that out because of their difficulty in being able to speak. The Broca's area is only found on one side of the brain, either the left or the right. It doesn't have a corresponding section on the other side. So here we go. So here's our brain again. And here's our central sulcus. This is a large fissure that divides the parietal and the frontal lobe. And notice here we have the primary somatic sensory area in blue on this side, and it's found in the parietal lobe, and it's on one side of this fissure, and on the other side of the fissure we have the motor area here in red. So there's our motor area, and then here's our Broca's area. So it's involved in being able to speak. We have language comprehension. We have an olfactory area where the signals is where we're able to figure out what we're smelling. So olfactory meaning smell. We have visual area. Notice that the visual area is in the very back of the brain. This is the front of the brain up here, and that's where our eyes are going to be. And so this is going to the nerves coming from our eyes are going to travel clear through the brain, clear back here to the area that is involved in vision as well. And you can see some other things. There's also a speech area here, and that's involved in sounding outwards, and that's found in the junction between the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital areas. We have the gustatory area as well. We're able to analyze the taste that we're tasting. So we have all these parts of the brain here that are controlling different parts. These are all found in the cortex, so the outer part, the gray matter of the brain. I want to show you this picture here of a homunculus. This is pretty interesting. And this is showing also the relationship between the sensory and also the motor areas. And what a homunculus means basically is a little person. That's how they define that word. And it's interesting how this came about. So when the very early brain surgery was being done, they realized that you could stimulate parts of the brain and see how that affected the body without hurting the patient. And so when they were doing the brain surgery, they would touch a part of the brain and see what that turned off, what that affected in the person, then take notes. And by doing that, they were able to make this little sketch of how the brain is controlling, and also where the sensory information is coming in to the brain. So for example, in the motor area here, you see the face. So this is the part of the brain that controls the muscles of the face. And here you see the tongue, very large tongue. So a very large face. And what this means is that a very large part of the brain is controlling the muscles of the face. So there's a lot of different muscles, which means that we have a lot of functions that we can do with our face. If you look at the rest of the body, all this part of the body has a very small, proportionally smaller area of the brain that controls it, going down to the legs. Here we have the hands as well. Notice how much of the brain is taken up by control of the hands. And so what this homunculus shows is the proportion of the brain that is controlling that area. And what that means is that there's going to be finer motor movements that are able to be done because of that, how much of the brain is being used. So this also is the same with the sensory side here. So notice again, you have a very large face. We have a lot of sensory information coming in from the face. Our lips are very sensitive, so there's a large part of the brain that is analyzing that information coming from the lips. And again, our tongue has a very large area, sensory area. And then again, the rest of our body, our hands have a lot of sensory, but the rest of our body in general doesn't have as many sensory information, sensory nerves going to that area. And you can also test this, do kind of a little experiment on yourself. And what you do is you take you can either use a paper clip and unwind the paper clip so that it has 2 points, or you can take a pair of toothpicks, whatever you want to do. And I said do it on yourself, but you'll actually need a partner for this because you'll know what you're doing. So it really won't work on you. But if you find someone in your house or a friend or something like that, have them close their eyes and then take those 2 points and try on different parts of the body, either touch them with just 1 point or with 2 points, and see how close those 2 points can be together, and they can still determine whether you're touching them with 1 point or 2 points. So for example, you can touch them on the fingertip, and you can have those 2 ends of the toothpick or the 2 ends of the paper clip far away, and see if they can feel that, move them closer together, and see at what point they can no longer tell whether it's 2 or 1. And if you try that on the arm versus a finger, you're going to notice that the fingers are much more sensitive. The arm, those 2 points have to be very far away before you can differentiate 1 versus 2 points hitting you. And that relates to this homunculus as well. So it's pretty interesting how our brain is set up. Now let's look at the brainstem and the different jobs that are carried out by the brainstem. Then we have what's called the diencephalon, and this is the very top of the brainstem. And this is totally covered by this cerebrum, so you can't see the brainstem unless you make a sagittal cut through and be able to see it there. And it has 3 main parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So let's go down to this next slide here, and you can see here's our diencephalon here. So up inside the brain. And we have the pituitary gland coming off of the diencephalon. So the thalamus, it surrounds the third ventricle, and this is where sensory impulses come into the brain, and then it's going to send them to the different parts of the brain that are going to be able to interpret that. And so this is kind of the relay station where things are coming in, it's sending them off to different places where they need to go. The hypothalamus, so hypo means less or under, this is found under the thalamus, and this is very important in the autonomic nervous system. So body temperature, a lot of things are related to homeostasis, water balance, metabolism, all of these are the thalamus. The thalamus is important for that reason. Sorry, the hypothalamus is important for that reason. And the hypothalamus also is part of the important in the endocrine system as well, because it produces two hormones that are sent to the pituitary gland and then are sent out. And the pituitary gland is found below the hypothalamus. It's connected to that. So the hormones that produce the hypothalamus sent there, and we'll see more about that in chapter 9 when we get to that point. Then we also have the epithalamus, and this is found above the thalamus, and this is where the pineal body is found, and that's something that also talk about in the endocrine system, but it's able to detect the light, and then also it's involved in the formation of cerebrospinal fluid as well. Okay, next we have the brainstem. There's three parts to the brainstem. This is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And the brainstem is what connects the rest of the brain to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord comes off the medulla oblongata, and it's continuous with that structure. So the midbrain, first of all, is mostly made up of nerve fibers. It has two fiber tracts that are listed here that you don't need to memorize, but this is where we have reflex centers for vision and hearing are found here. Okay, the pons, it's a little bulging part. It sticks out a little bit when you look at a picture of the brain. So here's the pons. It looks like a little bean stuck to the brain, but it bulges out. And here's the midbrain, and there's our pons there. Its job is to control breathing, and then it has a lot of fibers coming through it as well. But if something happens to the pons, then breathing is not going to happen, and that's definitely a problem. Then we have the medulla oblongata, which is below the pons, and this is what merges with the spinal cord. And it also has a lot of fiber tracts running through it down into the body, but it also has a lot of control mechanisms as well. So heart rate is controlled here, blood pressure, breathing, swallowing, vomiting, all of these things controlled by a lot of reflex type reactions are controlled by the medulla oblongata. And then we have something called the reticular formation, and this is gray matter that is found along the brainstem. And this has a lot of control with the visceral organs, and then also has something called the RAS, or the reticular activating system, that is important in the sleep cycles that happen, and also consciousness. If something happens to the reticular formation, so it gets damaged, then the patient will go into coma because of. Last of all, we have something called the cerebellum. And when you're looking at the brain, this is found underneath the cerebrum, and it looks like a cauliflower, basically. It's got all these kind of projections and things, kind of like a little tree. If you cut it open, it looks kind of like a little tree, the cauliflower. And this is important in coordination. It's found in the back of the head, and it coordinates all the body movements. So even though the cerebrum is sending out those motor signals, the cerebellum translates that into fluid movement. If the cerebellum is damaged, then you're going to walk like you're drunk all the time, and this is when, so somebody that's been drinking a lot, that's going to affect your cerebellum, and that's why you're no longer able to have those fluid motions, those fluid movements as you walk around. And those are the parts of the brain.